Good evening, everybody. This is Dr. Bob here with a very special guest tonight, Mr. Cotto. How about you introduce yourself to the Dr. Bob audience?
Well, I'm Joseph Cotto. I am the co-host of Cotto Gottfried, as you may or may not know. I also am fairly active on Twitter, and I've written a few books, neither of which made much of a splash, but a new one's going to be coming out next month, which I hope will be pretty relevant. I think that's a good way of putting it. So anyway, that's my story in a very brief nutshell.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I've certainly enjoyed the discussions that you and Dr. Gottfried have had on your channel, the number and range of guests that you've had. I do think it is probably for conservatives out there the most intellectually stimulating channel in social media. I'm very thankful for what y'all do, and I'm certainly looking forward to the good work in the future. You and I have been having discussions for a while, talking about certain religio-political movements that have been going on in the United States, particularly within conservative circles. As my audience is aware, I have a number of against videos where I have stood against a number of theological as well as political perspectives. And so this is another in the against series of videos. And tonight is called Against Groyperism. But before we start with that, I sort of wanted to go into the motivation for what we were doing tonight, and sort of recap religious events that are quite relevant to our conversation tonight. So, Cotto, did you happen to catch the Southern Baptist Convention this week? And tell me some of your general thoughts.
I did not follow closely, but I heard bits and pieces of it, one might say. And it was very clear to me from what I did hear that the conservative faction of the SBC basically lost on all fronts. And I was not terribly surprised to hear about that. Although I do remember, I'm not Southern Baptist myself, but when I was a boy, the Southern Baptists in my neck of the woods in Central Florida were profoundly conservative and very visible presence in the community. One might say that there was something of a conservative bedrock in the area, which still votes GOP today, but obviously it's not as socially conservative as it used to be. But to see the Southern Baptists go toward the left so dramatically is not surprising in the context of broader American Christianity, but I suppose you could say surprising on a lower level in that it's just shocking to see this, once conservative bastion transform itself so radically. It's just jarring to look at. I don't imagine that the conservatives will be able to gain much traction in the SBC going forward, although it is interesting that Russell Moore, who was a supporter of reform, used to be head of the SBC. He wound up leaving, as we were discussing, for Presbyterianism. So it's an odd situation, but not one that was impossible to foresee.
Yeah, it's frustrating. It's interesting, though, that you mentioned Southern Baptists there in Central Florida. I'm not sure if how far away Cape Coral is from where you're at. I think
it's pretty far, but I know the area.
Yeah. So the guys who run Founders Ministries, which is a sort of Reformed Baptist wing within the Southern Baptist Convention, they're trying to get Southern Baptists to go back to their roots, specifically in the area of Reformed theology and Calvinism. But they're also a conservative bastion. They are one of the wings of the conservative movement within, or one of the conservative wings within the Southern Baptist Convention. The other one is the Conservative Baptist Network. Sort of the events that led up, and this will tie into our larger discussion, because it really is just another case in point of the decline of traditional American Protestantism in the United States. And as American Protestantism, at least as a defined, organized movement or institution, declines, that will have massive cultural, political, social, and religious impacts upon the country at large. So some of the events that led up to, and I think provide context to what happened at the SBC this week. really, I think, traced back to 1979 and what was called the conservative resurgence, in which Paige Patterson and Adrian Rogers and other members of the uh, conservative faction within the Southern Baptist Convention saw that the SBC was a denomination in decline at that time. But fortunately, due to Baptist polity, there was actually a chance to overturn the liberal drift by electing new leadership, which is something I think that is actually quite unique to Baptists, particularly when we are compared to not only our fellow Protestants, but especially to the sacral churches that we're going to talk about tonight. So Adrian Rogers was elected as president of the SBC in 1979, expelling which began the process of the expulsion of liberals and quote unquote moderates who really were just liberals by any other name. People who had brought into sort of liberalism 1.0, higher criticism, the dogmas of evolution, sort of this Fabian socialist ideal, sort of what you see in sort of mainstream Episcopalianism today, was essentially the trajectory that the SBC was headed. But due to the conservative resurgence, that all stopped. The seminaries were cleared of heretical and non-conservative and non-traditional faculty, and it seemed like the SBC had actually become the first Protestant denomination to reverse its liberal drift and inevitable decline. But during the late 2000s, with the election of Barack Obama, I think, as I mentioned on one of your streams as a guest before, that what we really began to see there was the decline and end of what became the religious right in the United States. Is that sort of your sense too, Joseph?
I think that the religious right in the U.S., which I, of course, never remembered, but I was quite familiar with it, I think that it saw a zenith under George W. Bush, but that was very much it having a false dawn, because a lot of people then believed that the religious right would be the future of the Republican Party and perhaps even American politics. But George Bush tarnished, the image of the GOP so much, and certainly the image of the religious right, that after his presidency ended and Obama became president, and then the country started focusing on race and this and that and the other thing, even though it's supposed to be a post-racial period, go figure. I think that the religious right got scared. It wanted a new image for itself. But at the same time, back then, the country was more socially conservative, so it wasn't quite willing to go as far to the left as it has now, to the extent that I'll be really say there is a big religious right still out there, at least not in an organized sense. But I think that the presidency of Barack Obama scared it. I think that the presidency of George W. Bush, which it benefited tremendously from, wound up backfiring on it. So the religious right by the early 2010s, even late 2000s, which say 2009, it was in a really tough spot. And throughout the 2010s, it veered toward the left, not only because of, say, Obama or Bush, but because of younger people within it. The children of Christian conservatives tended to adopt social justice perspectives. And they, while they would not have called themselves, theological progressives, they were much more interested in, the common good, you could even say social justice warfare, even though that sort of, I think, metastasized in the late 2010s, but mid to late 2010s. But there was a generational shift as well. So I think there are a lot of different moving parts to make the religious right more left-leaning, and certainly to turn it into what it is today, which isn't even like a coherent national organization. If I were to say, I would say that the religious right had its Waterloo politically in 2017 with Roy Moore, because Roy Moore in Alabama was essentially left with only the religious right supporting him after a bunch of stuff came to public knowledge about him, whether it was true or not, who knows. But the religious right alone backed him essentially, and he still lost even in Alabama. And I think that election sort of was the period on the final sentence, in the final sentence of the religious right's relevancy on the American political scene as a force in and of itself. Now, it still has relevance as a component of the GOP, absolutely no question. But in that case, it's just part of a coalition. It's not like something that alone is able to wield much power.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think one thing that we had talked about before is in the aftermath of 9/11, there was a lot of cultural capital that was squandered by the religious right, particularly as it related to the Iraq War and the blind support for the state of Israel, which uh, we're going to criticize the Groyper movement for its not just anti-Israel leanings, but sort of the almost implicit anti-Semitic, if I may go so far myself, to discuss some of these beliefs. I'm no fan of sending foreign aid to other countries. I'm very much an old school, Paleo Con, Calvin Coolidge type of conservative who's like, I don't really think America should be in the business of empire building. But at the same time, I don't have some sort of special hatred for the state of Israel. I think it is probably one of the only sane countries that exists in that part of the world, where people can actually have differing religious opinions and beliefs. Is it a perfect country? By no stretch of the imagination. And I do have criticisms for some of the handling of our relationship with the state of Israel. But at the same time, I think this sort of reactionary attitude that certain segments of the Groyper right, if I may call them that, towards the state of Israel, I think is just misplaced. But at the same time, this sort of dispensational premillennial, John Hagee style of evangelicalism and its blind support for interventionist wars in the Middle East set up the collapse of the Bush administration during its second term and gave fertile ground to the rise of someone like Barack Obama. And so I think the religious right really, in a lot of ways, shot itself in the foot in advocating for the things that it did. And when they tried to advocate for more conservative social policies in the second half of the Bush administration, Bush really turned on them. Instead of focusing on issues such as, a constitutional marriage amendment or the issue of abortion, he started going after taxes and wanting to privatize Social Security. And it's like all these people who had come out to support him. And I believe 2004 was the last time that the once great state of Virginia actually voted Republican. This coalition essentially dissipated after that.
Mm-hmm. It did. Virginia obviously is never going back to the GOP demographically. It's gone. I think that looking at the religious right, it did have, as I said, a false dawn in 2004. There was even an op-ed in the New York Times, as I recall, after the 2004 election, which obviously was won by George Bush, running heavily on Christian conservative themes, which were soon squandered, as you mentioned. But the New York Times ran an op-ed saying the day the Enlightenment went out, which meant that they believed, as did the religious right, that there was going to be some long-term domination of religious rightism in American politics. But that very quickly went out of style, even as early as 2006, when the Democrats took back Congress, and the GOP was criticized not only for the Iraq War, but for the form of religiosity which George W. Bush brought to the table in his administration, which even alienated many Christians. Obviously, it alienated everyone else, but also alienated many Christians. The thing of it is with George W. Bush is that he appointed lots and lots and lots of Christian conservatives to positions in the HHS, some even in the Justice Department. But these people, even though they funneled money to various, NGOs of Christian conservative nature, even though they put, sometimes Bible verses on memoranda, at the end of the day, they did not advance the position of Christian conservatism in this country at all. As a matter of fact, they wound up creating a worse position for it. So then when you look at what happened in 2010 with the Tea Party, that was the beginning of the GOP really jettisoning Christian conservatism. That was obviously a reaction to the Obama era, the Tea Party, the runaway spending, but also just general angst about the government being used in a direction to advance lefty principles, and the government was growing ever larger, which made people on the right, or feel ever more nervous about persecution. So it was very interesting. And by the time Trump came around in the mid 2010s, the religious right was basically something that's just part of the GOP coalition. But it did try to have one last gasp at relevancy all on its own with Roy Moore. And that turned out how it turned out. So it's I mean, it's a long story. And I suppose for a lot of people, something of a depressing story. But it is a very interesting story, the religious rights faith in American politics. Looking, though, at George W. Bush and how he handled it, he squandered basically his entire presidency, so it's not a surprise that the religious right angle will go down the tubes as well. But as far as Israel goes, there's no question that a lot of people in the religious right have an affinity for the country, which I don't think is a bad thing, but they take it to a level of theological importance that is, I'm not a Christian, but even I find it to be, a little odd to say the least. But at the same time, I'd rather them be that than anti-Semites. As far as the Groypers go, I think there's a very interesting matter with them. I think a lot of them are very young. They don't have a very broad depth of knowledge about American history, certainly not world history then. And they tend to believe that because American Jews are so left of center, generally speaking, even though there are some trends toward the right in Florida and among Jews who come from the former Soviet Union who hate communism, but the Groypers see basically all Jews everywhere as sort of Upper West Side lefties who write for the New Yorker or the New York Times. And they tend to believe that by being anti-Israel, they can then oppose these people, these American Jews who they have disdain for. But in reality, most American Jews don't care about Israel that much. And certainly the lefty ones in New York absolutely despise the right of center establishment in Israel, that they hate it. They're embarrassed by it. They think that it is something of white supremacy. I've literally read what they have to say, and they're very serious about this. There's no question. And so what then happens is that these Groypers go up against Israel, but they don't realize that they're actually challenging a very conservative group of people. Since the Groypers tend to be, even though a lot of them are minorities, ironically, they tend to be very, I'll be kind, white interested. They're challenging a group of very conservative whites, the only group in the Middle East. And it really, makes no sense. But, these people, like I said, they don't have a broad depth of knowledge of history at all. And what they wind up doing then, beyond Jews in Israel, is that they have a view of the past, a triumphalist view of the past,
yes,
where it was great. And I don't think it was great. I'm just speaking, sharing their views. It was great that the Inquisition happened. It was great that the Protestants were persecuted, so on and so forth. They think all this was just tops because they believe it's their point of view dominating over all others. What they don't realize is that the way they live now, they would have been persecuted as well because they didn't meet the standards of behavior which the Inquisitionists liked. Many Groypers are, as we both know, closeted homosexuals. They would have been killed. So it's really a unique state of affairs these people have, I think, born out of immense historical ignorance, and it produces a kind of arrogance that's really a sight to behold, put mildly.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that when I discuss a little bit of church history, because as somebody who is Reformed and as somebody who has studied a fair bit of church history, I find the sort of popular, almost mythical view of church history that Catholic and Orthodox Groypers in particularly, and even more so the Orthodox Groypers than the Catholic Groypers, not only to be arrogant, but to be quite ignorant as well of the actual events that happened in history and the developments. But, Joseph, we just can't understand because we're the unwashed. I would be a heretic and you would be, just an evil, secularist. But they're part of the one true holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and what could a lowly Baptist know, or even, somebody who is of a more secular persuasion know about Christian history? But we will get into that a little bit. But sort of returning, you mentioned the year 2010, and I think this was the beginning of the end of the conservative resurgence within the Southern Baptist Convention. I'll tell you a little bit about sort of the developments within the past decade in the SBC that led to what we saw this week. In 2010, at the annual meeting, there was the passage of something called the Great Commission Resurgence. As you and I have discussed in the past, many of the elites and the establishment within the Southern Baptist Convention are quite ashamed of its Southern heritage and of its Southern history. And they have been trying to change the name for a long time now from the Southern Baptists to the quote-unquote Great Commission Baptists, to focus on what they would consider the aim of the convention, which is the training of pastors and the sending out of missionaries to fulfill the Great Commission of Matthew 28, to go and baptize all nations, disciple them. So that has been the focus. But what they did is they actually disrupted historic Baptist policy through the passage of the Great Commission Resurgence, of which Ronnie Floyd, who's the current chairman of the executive committee of the Southern Baptist Convention, he was on that committee at the time. Kevin Ezell, who's the head of NAM, which Russell Moore, Albert Mohler, these are big names within the SBC that even people outside the SBC have heard of. We're all involved with this. And essentially what it did is it took away the power of local associations and state Baptist conventions to fund and appoint their own missionaries. And it brought all of that under the umbrella of the larger Southern Baptist North American Mission Board. For those who are not aware of Baptist polity, there is no, theoretically, higher organization within Baptist life than the local church. There is no bishops. There is no ecclesiastical hierarchy. There's not even a sense of a presbytery in the way that our Presbyterian friends would organize themselves, where there is an elder board that sits over a local region of Presbyterian churches. It is independent, autonomous local churches coming together in local associations at a higher level than that, state conventions, and ultimately through the Southern Baptist Convention to cooperate, hence the name cooperative program, to fund seminaries, to fund the mission agencies. And what a lot of people don't realize when it comes to American religious life, the SBC is well positioned technically. I'm not sure how long that's going to last, to dominate the American religious scene, particularly within Protestantism. As the SBC goes, so goes the rest of evangelicalism. And what I mean by that is a third of all seminary students trained in North America from all Christian denominations, and even beyond that, other non-Christian religions, a third of all professional, vocational, ministerial students in this country are trained in Southern Baptist seminaries, which that is an absolutely astounding statistic, considering the wide array and diversity of the American religious landscape and the fact that Southern Baptists ostensibly only make up 5% of all American Christians. But to sort of return real quick, Joseph, just the story, and this will probably leave you in a lot of pain as I unwind this over the next 5 to 10 minutes. So that Great Commission Resurgence took away power from local churches, local associations, and state conventions and put it under the umbrella of the national SBC. Technically, no autonomous church, local church is an SBC church. They are in friendly cooperation with the Southern Baptist Convention. That's why Baptist churches will jump in and out all the time. And it's become an especially alarming trend that 5,000 conservative churches, including my own, have either left or are leaving within the past few years. So fast forward to the year 2018, you've had this liberal drift in the seminaries and in the mission agency for 8 years by that point. And there has always been an element of pragmatism within the Southern Baptist Convention and within sort of low church Protestantism in general in the United States, where we're not going to stand on theological principles. We're not going to, stand, and plant our flag on our confessions of faith. We're going to, do what the world thinks. And, you've probably seen this in your area with, vacation Bible schools and with, a lot of these large mega churches that have moved to the rock band style of worship and to the skinny jeans, V-neck, pastor who has, the multi-site church. These are all, pragmatic solutions to what they see as a change in the culture. So in 2018, and also the removal of the name Baptist from many of these churches, it was funny. You might get a kick out of this. I had a friend who has been banned for the fourth straight Southern Baptist Convention on Twitter for trolling the SBC. And he has a game called Church, Bar, or Nightclub, and he'll list the names of churches like, Elevation, High Point, The Rising, these sorts of names of these sort of modern, faux non-denominational Southern Baptist churches. And there was the election of J.D. Greear as president of the SBC in 2018, and he runs an organization in the Raleigh-Durham area called the Summit Church. They used to be Homestead Heights Baptist Church, but that was just too, Southern and too bigoted and racist. So we had to change it to the Summit Church, and he is essentially acting as a bishop over a 15-site mega church in which 14 of the sites, their local campus pastor doesn't even preach on Sunday mornings. They literally pull down a video screen and it's JD there in his skinny jeans and in his short, button-up t-shirt where he can accentuate his biceps, talking about things like, gender justice and, pronoun hospitality and, getting on and saying how we as Southern Baptists need to just say, Black Lives Matter, it's like, which is a truism in and of itself, but he is aligning himself with a radical leftist movement. So he was elected, and what he began to do, the president of the SBC doesn't have a lot of power, but what he does have is the power to appoint the person who chairs the Committee on Committees. And it's like, well, you may ask, well, what is the Committee on Committees? Well, the Committee on Committees appoints the trustees for the various entities of the Southern Baptist Convention. What are the entities of the Southern Baptist Convention? You in the audience may ask. They are 6 Southern Baptist seminaries, Southeastern, Southern, New Orleans, Midwestern, Southwestern, and Golden Gate, or what has been renamed Gateway. The 2 mission sending agencies, the International Mission Board and the North American Mission Board. There's a disaster relief organization. There's one other charity organization, and then there is the infamous Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. Mm-hmm. And so what J.D. Greear did by appointing the people who run the Committee on Committees, all of these people began to appoint trustees to these various entities. And I'll ask you a question sort of half rhetorically, Joseph. How conservative and normative and traditional do you think these trustees that J.D. Greear appointed were?
I would say he went out of his way to make them as different from the Southern Baptist traditional mainstream as possible.
That is correct. And the North American Mission Board, which basically runs the Southern Baptist Convention right now, Kevin Ezell and his right-hand man, Dhati Lewis, both of whom are at least Dhati Lewis is a formal heretic. They have shifted the focus of evangelism within the Southern Baptist Convention to away from the suburbs and away from rural areas towards what are called, quote unquote, send cities. So places like Atlanta, Chicago, New York, New Orleans, Seattle, Los Angeles, they've moved away pretty much all of their church planting efforts outside of the suburbs and in rural areas where you think they would actually have a lot of capital and a lot of ability for evangelism and people who would be open to moving towards planting churches, almost all of whom do not have the name Baptist in the church name, trying to court, shall we say, a non-traditional Southern Baptist demographic, because heaven is going to look like all people from all, tribes, tongues, people, and nations. So therefore, we in the church today in the United States have to support refugee resettlement in places like East Tennessee. This was actually mentioned in the convention, by the way. oh, isn't it such a great thing that we've imported tens of thousands of Kurdish refugees into Tennessee? You know, we'll just, you know, convert them to Christ, you know, because that's just going to be, you know, easy peasy. Same here in the Raleigh-Durham area, where we have all these refugees, and a former large Southern Baptist church that I was a part of decided, oh yeah, we want all these refugees so we can, you know, teach them English and, you know, have them come into the church, and we'll plant, you know, the Chinese church and the Indian church and, you know, the Nigerian church. You know, we're just going to have this, you know, multicultural, you know, rainbow nation, you know, South African style, you know, church where everybody's just going to magically get along. It's been a total fiasco. So that has caused the churches to go into decline in terms of baptism numbers. The North American Mission Board spends 3 times the amount of money today to plant half the churches that it did in 2010. And I don't think that is all due to the secularization in the culture, even though that may play a minority role in that. I think a lot of that has been misguided, misplaced, shall we say, pathologically altruistic motives on the part of the leadership within the SBC. Mm-hmm. So Greer was supposed to only have 2 years as president, but then last year, of course, COVID happened, and we did not have a convention. So at the last convention in 2019, at the end of the convention, there was a resolution that came up, Resolution 9, on critical race theory and the gospel. And during this resolution, it basically said that, yes, while we reject the quote-unquote worldview of critical race theory and intersectionality, we can employ them as quote-unquote helpful analytical tools, which I'm not sure you can divorce Marxist analysis from the Marxist worldview. I don't know, maybe you have a more intelligent way of doing that than the leadership of the SBC does, Joseph. But that is essentially what happened. And so the Minute founders, who are the Calvinist conservative wing, you know, tried to stop this. They failed to do this because Albert Mohler did not want to go against one of his own seminary professors, Curtis Woods, who promoted this woke resolution out of the resolutions committee. And so for 2 years, this has been sort of bubbling underneath the surface, this deepening conservative versus, you know, new, young and woke SBC, the sort of traditional, you know, suburban and rural churches against the more urban churches. Of course, a lot of the suburban churches have gone over to the urban side. And there was the formation of something called the Conservative Baptist Network, which Dr. Albert Mohler opposed, and Russell Moore opposed, because they're conservatives, and even though they're more Arminian, they and Founders Ministry aligned together to try and take back the convention here in 2021. So they actually put forward a man by the name of Mike Stone, who is a conservative from Blackshear, Georgia, just north of the state line from where you're at there in Florida. It's just about 40 miles north of Jacksonville, the little town of Blackshear. And he was running against both Albert Mohler, Ed Litton, and another minor conservative candidate by the name of Randy Adams, but that will be for another stream. But what happened at the convention is the conservatives were like, okay, we're going to get as many people to Nashville as we can. We're going to repeal Resolution 9. We're going to put our guy, conservative Mike Stone, in there, and we're going to oppose Ed Litton, who is the woke guy, and we're going to oppose the swamp and the establishment, which is Albert Mohler. Well, they got there, and when Mike Stone got there, they did a hit job on him, the left in the convention. They had this abuse survivor who came up to him, you know, screaming hysterically before the convention even started, like, you've supported, you know, the cover-up of abuse in the convention and blah, 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 blah. And, you know, my heart goes out to this girl and of herself, but she was clearly being used by the woke faction within the SBC to essentially Roy Moore Mike Stone. And things kept going from bad to worse within the convention hall. Hold on one second. So Mike Stone won the initial balloting. What was very interesting is that Albert Mohler, who, if you had had this election 2 years ago, would have probably won with over 90% of the vote, he only got 25%. Albert Mohler has essentially lost his theological children to the woke division of the SBC, and so he's lost his left wing. And then because he has refused to stand up for the conservatives, he lost the Conservative Baptist Network and Founders to his right. And so Albert Mohler is essentially the Jeb Bush of the SBC, if that makes sense. So it became a two-way runoff between Mike Stone, the conservative, and Ed Litton, the woke guy. And, Ed Litton, who is a formal heretic, who has a false definition of the Trinity, and who has had his wife preach with him in church, and who has talked about critical race theory and intersectionality in glowing terms from his pulpit, even while denouncing the ideology in name. He has promoted it in substance. Ended up winning by a mere 4 percentage points in the runoff, 52-48. Not only did that happen, the push to rescind Resolution 9 from the 2019 convention was ruled out of order by J.D. Greear, of course. Rod Martin, who is the conservative stalwart on the executive committee, was forced to step down. The motions to deal with transparency issues were all ruled out of order, which, by the way, Planned Parenthood has a higher transparency rating as an organization than the Southern Baptist Convention does. If that tells you about the grift that the SBC elites are running. And
it's almost like they learned from the Catholic Church. It's really something else.
Oh, yes. And so all of the downstream ballots, all the downstream elections except for one, went to woke candidates. And now that Ed Litton, who the New York Times called a moderate, is going to be doing the same thing that J.D. Greear has been doing for the past 3 years as president over the next 2 years, which is solidifying the woke control of the denomination. The conservatives are trying to, say, well, we only lost by 4 percentage points and we're going to do better next time, guys, without realizing that, the woke have basically taken the tactics of the Democratic Party and have brought it to the Southern Baptist Convention. Russell Moore, as we mentioned earlier, threw a Molotov cocktail, essentially accusing Mike Stone before Russell Moore left the SBC with a 6-month golden parachute to join a Presbyterian church and get a new job at Christianity Today, making even more money and doing even more damage than he was doing at the ERLC. Basically poisoned the well on his way out. And so, needless to say, SBC 2021 has been a total and utter fiasco for the conservative wing of the SBC, and along with much of mainline Protestantism and other even evangelical Protestant denominations who have now embraced wokeism, we are going to see the continuing decline of Protestantism as an institutionalized force in the United States. So with that, I wanted to sort of turn things back over to you again, Joseph, before we jump into talking about the Groyper movement. Just talking about why the decline of the mainline Protestant churches, as well as now the decline of evangelical churches, is so important to the character of the United States. And specifically, I see the center of the traditional American nation as being a fundamentally English-speaking British Isle descent, with other groups from Protestant Europe having immigrated here and assimilating to that larger English culture, who are fundamentally Protestant in their character. So where do you see the center of the traditional American nation? Is that analysis something you would generally agree with?
I view America fundamentally in its origins as a British pioneer society. There was the English, of course, but then there was also the Scottish and what we now call the Scots-Irish, and the Welsh too. But they were such a small group that they really didn't necessarily make a great mark in and of themselves. They just came and typically absorbed the sort of British settler culture that was already here. So I think that America fundamentally is a British pioneer society in its origin, and that gave it its national macro culture for generations on end until the 1960s, really, when multiculturalism came in, and then you had much later social justice warfare. Before that, you have political correctness. I think I fast forwarded a bit too much, but now you have wokeness, which is basically a replacement religion for Christianity that comes out of the Christian tradition, but it has other attributes as well. And it basically is a secular form of salvation and hating oneself if you are white, at least, or even if you are cisgendered or not gay or lesbian or whatever the terms now are. So it's really an interesting state of affairs. Obviously, the Protestant religious movement has the greatest impact of any religious movement on American history. There were other religions here from the beginning. One founding father was Catholic, another was Jewish. The rest were of Protestant religion or Protestant religious background. And the thing of it is that without the sort of Anglo-Protestant cultural paradigm, you would not have a United States. There's no two questions about that. And a problem that a lot of people, I think like the Groypers, for instance, have with American history is that they see themselves as outsiders within this very obvious, historical setup. And they're not very big on history, as I said before, but it doesn't take someone who's terribly knowledgeable about history to recognize that, the sort of Catholic trad or Orthodox trad thing they bring about is not going to find a very, happy home within the depths of American history. So I would say they try to remake the country in their own image, and to that extent, they're very similar to the woke folks or the conservatives who pretend that everything has traditionally been as Martin Luther King talked about. Meanwhile, they don't really know all that much about Martin Luther King himself, but that's another story for another time. So it's I see all these essentially pastiches. That's what they are, masquerading as the genuine article. And it's very sad to see for a host of reasons. But before I say anything else, I would like to discuss how the media has covered what happened with the Southern Baptist Convention.
Sure.
And I'll just read headlines, not to read articles. But from Vox, the Southern Baptist Convention is at war with itself. Slate, evangelicals are course correcting away from Donald Trump. The New York Times, Southern Baptist vote signals further fractures in American evangelicalism. CNN, Southern Baptist Convention can dodge a schism, but not its own history. NPR, Southern Baptists elect a new president, Ed Litton, who is seen as a bridge builder. From, what is this, Fox, I think it is? Is this Fox, a local Fox TV affiliate? I may not be. It's from Arkansas, though. It says former cross-church pastor involved in the Southern Baptist Convention controversy. The Tennessean, what's next? Narrow election wins highlight. Continued wins highlight. Continued risks. The Southern Baptist Convention. The Alabamian. Ed Litton, 6 things to know about Alabama pastor and now leads Southern Baptist Convention. The AP, Southern Baptists vote to probe leader sex abuse response. And finally, Newsweek, Southern Baptist Convention leader Ed Litton says QAnon conspiracy theories are fables. So it seems to me that the media, number one, is very glad that the Southern Baptist Convention is at war with itself. And it's also very glad that the Southern Baptist Convention is tilting leftward, and it's using this against the specter of Donald Trump. So I think that the media essentially is enamored of what's going on with the SBC right now. And that place that I said was a Fox News affiliate, I was wrong. I believe it's an independent TV station in Fayetteville, Arkansas. But anyway, so I think that generally speaking, people get the gist of what the media is up to with regard to what happened at the SBC this week, and the media is very pleased by it for various reasons.
Yes, and I think that is an excellent analysis. Anytime your former enemies all of a sudden have a change of heart about you, particularly if they are the American mainstream media, that should be a warning for the direction that you are going. Yeah, it's interesting. I wanted to get back to sort of talking about the sort of positive, not in a moral sense, but in a technical sense, aspect that this sort of British pioneer character has left upon the American nation, particularly as it pertains to religion. As American settlers went out into the vast landscape of North America, they brought with them a few things, which was the English language and a certain cultural heritage, and as part of that, they brought with them the King James Bible. And so, just a question for you, Joseph: how has this sort of Anglo-Protestant culture left a mark on the character of the historic American nation?
I think it has made it traditionally very much opposed to centralized government as the solution for all things. I think it has made it predisposed towards self-reliance. It's made it distrustful of foreign influences, even though America's had a very large influx of immigrants for some time. And I think it has made it the sort of place where people are interested in self-development, bettering themselves. And that has led them, obviously, toward what Weber calls Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism. It's why traditionally so many people in America had such financial success. They weren't all Protestants, needless to say, but they wound up adapting to a culture that came out of this, Protestant work ethic, often be getting great wealth. Nowadays, you see less economic mobility. You see less people being able to even afford a house because this Protestant work ethic by society at large, not just, individuals themselves, has been shunned. And, something, wokeness now is the new religion. But even before that, it was thought that people should be given more, I suppose, group advantages or a hand up. And that made them obviously less interested in getting ahead because they grew complacent. And so that eventually created the situation we have now, which is still changing. It's by no means at its final destination. But America has had a very, very rapid departure from the culture which came about from Anglo-Protestantism. And the results of that should be clear enough for anyone to see. And even as a secular guy, I can see it. I would much rather live in a society dominated by Anglo-Protestants than, Latin Catholic trad types, because the Anglo-Protestant society at least has a focus on rights and liberties and personal achievement, while other societies do not have this at all.
Yes, and you mentioned this sort of Anglo-Protestant character, and I know there's a book that you and Dr. Godfrey have talked about before that talks about the four streams of, I guess, types of British people who immigrated to the United States. Could you elaborate on that a little bit further?
I remember it vaguely, but the four types, I actually forgot them, but I do remember what you're talking about. I will see if I could look it up. But there was certainly a clash, a little clash, a divide between the people in the North and the people in the South that came to the U.S. from Britain, because the people who came to the U.S. from Britain from the South tended to be focused on commercial enterprises, and they came from the British Caribbean very often. The people who came from the North would come directly from Britain itself, and they would often come fleeing religious persecution, ironically setting up societies which persecuted people all the same. This is where Puritanism and pietism come from on the American political scene. In the South, and this is ironic because people in the North today would see the South as, fanatically religious, a backwater, uncultured, but traditionally the South was far more tolerant than the North when it came to religion and social issues. Moreover, it was only after the Civil War that the South was destroyed by the North, and the North sort of left its mark on the South, which made it rather fanatical in nature, which was a very unfortunate development, to say the absolute least. So the South has a unique history on the basis of who came here, as the North has a unique basis of history, judging from who came there.
Yeah, so the book I was thinking of is called Albion Sea by
that's it.
David Hackett Fisher, the Four British Folkways in America.
Yes. He really focuses on Scots-Irish in that book, which is a a fascinating group and really informed the American character in Appalachia, as well as even parts of Florida. A lot of people came to Florida from Appalachia. Once upon a time, Florida had more per capita Scottish descended people than any other state, but then a lot of English descended people came here after the Civil War. So it's directly from England. So it's really fascinating stuff how British immigration shaped the character of the United States. And I think that what you can see today with wokeness and all this stuff is how does one put it? Is the victory of the sort of Northeastern Puritanism / pietism. I'm not saying all Puritans were like this. Is the pietist strain that I'm particularly focused on. But SJWism represents the cultural residue of that finally claiming victory over American spirituality, I would say. And what we see today certainly does come from the pietism of those Puritans who were dominant in the Northeast, burning witches, or people who they thought were witches, to be precise. They weren't even burning; they were hanging. But people often say burning erroneously, as I just did. But it's really a fascinating state of affairs, and we still are living with the aftermath of this British immigration to the present U.S., even though the U.S. no longer has a core of cultural identity nationwide, which is derived from the United Kingdom.
Yes, I think that is certainly true. One thing I think that is an interesting sort of subtopic within this, British, Anglo-Protestant character of America is the balance of power of the various Protestant denominations within the United States. I was talking to an Orthodox colleague of mine who is wanting to understand, like, well, what is Protestantism and how did it come about and that sort of stuff, because he was raised as a cradle Catholic, but had an Orthodox mother who was an immigrant from an Eastern Bloc country. And so when the Catholic priest abuse scandal happened, his mother led the entire family away from Catholicism and into Orthodoxy. And I told him, in order to understand Protestantism as it exists today, you really have to understand the English Reformation specifically. While there are certainly Lutherans in the world today, they're actually a tiny minority of Protestants generally. If you look at all of the different versions of Protestantism that exist today, whether that be Presbyterians or Congregationalists or Baptists or Methodists or Pentecostals, or even these sort of breakaway American religions such as the Churches of Christ, the Campbellite movement, out of which came groups like the Seventh-day Adventists and the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses. You really have to understand the English Reformation and the history of the Anglican Communion specifically. And the fact that when the Westminster Assembly happened, the formation of Baptists as a distinct group actually was specifically spurred on by an act of Parliament, where Parliament was asking all of the different congregations in England to essentially defend themselves. The Westminster Assembly was not merely a religious meeting. It actually was convoked by Parliament and approved by the King. And it was meant to get a hold upon the Reformation movement within England generally. So you had a number of different dissenting groups from the sort of high church Anglican communion that dominated the upper echelons of the Westminster Assembly. You had Congregationalists and you had Presbyterians, and you also had Congregationalists who had come to believe in believer's baptism. And that is the beginning of the Baptist movement, where they actually, in their first confession of faith, distinguished themselves from the continental Anabaptist movement with the funny line of, to those who call us Anabaptists, or who falsely call us Anabaptists. And so when you see these dissenting groups essentially being given leave by the king as undesirables to immigrate first, at least in the Scots-Irish case, to the Ulster Plantation, and then from there on to the New World, you have a predominance and a preponderance of dissenters from the sort of established Anglican communion and the established Church of England arriving in the American colonies. specifically Presbyterians and Congregationalists in the Northeast, as you mentioned, a sort of Puritan ethic. But one of the interesting things, particularly about the Southeast, is that you really had two different groups. You had the sort of English Cavaliers who came with their servants, who were, planters in Virginia, and many of these were, in fact, part of high church Anglican congregations. However, the people who began to fan out into the backcountry, particularly the Scots-Irish and these lower class sort of English servants of the Cavaliers, the Presbyterians and the Anglicans required seminary education for their ministers. The Baptists and the Methodists did not. And that's why you saw this proliferation of Baptist and Methodist congregations all throughout the rural South, and even pushing into the western part of the United States. Because unlike the Presbyterians and Anglicans, whose ministers had to stay close to the East Coast to be educated at places like Harvard and Yale and Princeton, Baptists did not have that. Neither did Methodists. And so that's why there's a joke in a lot of southern towns, as well as, getting out into places like Kansas and Oklahoma and historically, Arizona. You would have your Baptist church and your Methodist church, and those were essentially the two religious options that existed in many small American towns. And arising out of Methodism at the turn of the 20th century was the Pentecostal movement, and that's when you begin to have the proliferation of groups such as the Foursquare Church or the Church of God or the Assemblies of God, really arising out of Methodism. And so that, to me, forms the core of what you would almost consider the sort of lower working class religious landscape of the United States.
Mm-hmm. And I will say that I did find those exact four groups, which had slipped my tongue before. Reading from a review of Albion Seed, let's see, it said that during the colonial era, British America was settled by at least four large waves of immigrants: Puritans from East Anglia to Massachusetts, a small royalist elite and large numbers of indentured servants to Virginia, Quakers from the North Midlands and Wales to the Delaware Valley, and English-speaking peoples from the borders of North Britain and Northern Ireland to the Appalachian backcountry. Now, I do want to add here that when one talks about the lowlands of North Carolina, of South Carolina, of Georgia, and of course of Florida, where the whole thing is lowland, basically, the people who came there by and large were planter elite from Barbados, from Bermuda, and other such places. Some came directly from England, but I mean, they were all of English background. And they were, generally speaking, high church Anglicans that established an order that was similar to what one might expect in the feudal age, even the sort of thing they could not get away with in England itself by that time. So they really, did all they could to make a lot of money as quickly as possible. And because these were high church Anglicans, people were obviously not Protestant dissenters. They didn't come for religious liberty. They came to make money. That was their goal. And they just wanted to recreate a sort of what was then passé feudal British society with indentured servants and then, of course, the slaves. So it's really something else how this whole phenomenon took off. And how there were different British groups that came to the U.S. Florida, where I'm from, remained loyal to Britain during the Revolutionary War. That's how, high church, well-to-do, and patriotic toward the crown the British settlers here were. They were predominantly English, even though there were some Irish who were with them. These Irish were people who had converted to Anglicanism from Roman Catholicism, either themselves or their forefathers did. And even though they spoke with an Irish accent, they had the same mindset as the English planter elite. They actually became part of the English planter elite, even though they had names that were obviously Irish Gaelic. So it's really, really fascinating stuff how this worked out. And the Scots-Irish only came to Florida really after the U.S. took it over. That's another story. But there was a deeply commercial, deeply Anglican, but not fanatically religious British planter culture in the lowland South that was profoundly different from what you would see up in Massachusetts, in New York, in Pennsylvania. These places were effectively different countries. And the only
Yes.
reason they came together was because of the Union, which came out as a result of the American Revolution. A lot of people have told me, Britain did not take care of the colonies well. It did give them parliamentary representation, but that's because these were colonies. They were self-governing. They didn't have to. A lot of people here didn't want to be represented in Parliament because that meant that Parliament then would exercise domination over the local affairs, which is not the case. So
Yes.
there's a lot of intricacies here with the American British colonial history, and a lot of folks on the left and the right don't want to focus on the realities of this history.
Yes, and it's interesting. The what was it? 6 of the first 7 presidents in the United States, or 5 of the first 7, excluding John Adams, and I guess I'm not sure if John Quincy Adams was born in Massachusetts or in Virginia. But you look at men like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe. They come from this sort of landed gentry, English Cavalier, high church Anglican background. Even somebody like Richard Henry Lee, who is the grandfather of Robert E. Lee. And you see that Robert E. Lee himself was a very devout high church Anglican, as were many of the leaders of the Confederacy, who had inherited that from the, as we mentioned before, this English landed gentry group of people who had essentially set up the last bastion of feudalism within the Anglophone world.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah, and it's worth noting that back in England, even though there was a deeply classist society, feudalism was not acceptable. You could not just indenture someone to be your servant for years on end and not give them any recourse. You certainly could not have slaves in the UK. So it was really fascinating stuff. People came to the New World in order to relive the past, essentially, and I suppose we're still grappling with that.
Yes. So I wanted to ask a question to sort of transition us into the second half of the show, to talk about the issue of Groyperism. Is where do you see the decline in this sort of Anglo-Protestant culture? And, even though Groyperism, I think, is an insignificant movement by and large, you are seeing high-level conversions to Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy for this sort of longing for tradition. So where do you see the decline of Anglo-Protestantism, and how do you see the Groyper movement specifically, but as well the sort of Trad-Cath, sort of ortho-bro movement more generally seeking to fill that gap?
I think that the collapse of Anglo-Protestantism happened because a lot of people in the U.S. It started on the left, but it's boiled over to the right, no question. They've been taught that their history is boring, it's stale, in worst case, it's horrendous, it's evil, and people seek some sort of stability, some sort of, well, one might say, is spiritual sustenance. And they look toward these older religions and they see something exotic, something foreign, something that claims absolute truth, and they're attracted to that. Even if these people don't hate themselves as being of an Anglo-Protestant background, they would perceive these other religions as being somehow advantageous because they are different. And perhaps subconsciously, these people, they've been programmed because the society that we live in to love things that are different than them, even if they don't realize they're doing it. It just happens because it's like monkey see, monkey do. It's part of living, in a society like our own, where the past is so often demonized. So I think that this is, a big deal. And what a lot of people do is they romanticize Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism. They treat it, either religion, like it is something that is the answer to all their problems, the answer to all society's problems, quite literally a vision of heaven, and they go fanatical over it as a result. And that makes them totally impervious to seeing any inconvenient truths about these religions. Now, I will say that when it comes to looking for absolute truth, that people tend to be more enamored of Catholicism than Orthodoxy. But what happens now is that a lot of people who either convert to Roman Catholicism, or they would have converted to it a few years ago. They see how far left it's going, and how, despite all the smells and bells, it's basically it's becoming like the UCC, the United Church of Christ. So they wind up going to Orthodoxy instead. I think a lot of these people are better off just converting to traditional Anglicanism, to be honest with you, because even though they want a guide to live by, they clearly are at home within a sort of Protestant cultural milieu, or else they would never leave Roman Catholicism at all. They would believe in whatever it says, because that's what you're supposed to do. If it tells you that you're supposed to believe that pink is purple, you're supposed to believe that, and that's the end of the story. But these people, I think, are inherently not of that mindset, even though they purport to be. And quite often, I think they go to extremes in portraying themselves as these Trad-Caths, because deep down, they have real doubts about what they believe, but they can't vocalize those doubts. They can't even articulate them in their own minds. So they just have to act in contravention to these doubts, which means putting on a public face that's more and more Trad-Cath. It's a rather sad phenomenon, actually, if you look at it for what it is. But the people who are afflicted with it are never going to come to terms with that, or if they do, then they no longer will be part of their religion, really, or at least stop practicing. So I think that there's a lot of different moving parts here. I think that Orthodoxy is obviously much more multifaceted than Roman Catholicism. There's many different variants, but it is decentralized. But one must remember that it comes out of the Council of Nicaea, which was held by the Emperor Constantine, before there was a Roman Catholicism, before there was an Orthodoxy. You basically established the politicized Christian church, the universal church, which he hoped to transfer, and he did transfer powers of the Roman Empire to, because the Roman Empire was giving a fracture. He wanted to create a religion to hold it together. This version of Christianity, this Nicene version of Christianity, is paganized heavily. And I'm not anti-pagan, but I'm just saying it is paganized. And a lot of these people wind up believing, even though they claim they're believing the true Christianity, if you look at their rituals, look at the history of what they recite, it clearly comes out of various pagan creeds, and they can't come to terms with that either. Especially when when they are talking to a bishop who wears a hat that's the same style as what various pagan traditions gave their own priests a long time ago. And if you're talking about Roman Catholicism, they're literally lighting candles at the foot of a statue and praying to the statue. There's people just exactly as people in pagan temples did quite a while ago. So, I mean, there's a lot of inconsistency here, but the people don't see it. And as far as Orthodoxy goes, talking about that specifically, Orthodoxy itself has a lot of the same issues that Roman Catholicism does when it comes to obviously going way back, politicization with the Nicene, the Council of Nicaea, which formed the church that would later splinter off, Catholicism one way, Orthodoxy the other. Technically, the Catholics split from the Orthodox, but that's another matter for another time. But the thing of it is that because this branch of Christianity was so paganized and politicized from the beginning, it has lent itself to a continuing spirit of being abused for the purpose of controlling others. And this can happen in any religion, any Christian denomination, any religion, period. But there's a long history of it within the Catholic and Orthodox traditions. And so in Orthodoxy, specifically in Russia and other places as well, you see a lot of corruption. You see a lot of double dealing, I'll say, behind closed doors. Yes. You see a lot of going along to get along. In Greece, you even see this with the Greek Orthodox Church being rather woke, actually. It's not anything anything that's terribly new. But so Orthodoxy, even though people might see that as being a purer form of Christianity or Catholicism, and it is if you go back to the Nicene version of it, no question. But still, right from the beginning of this Nicene branch of Christianity, because of what Constantine had intended to make it Romanized, there was going to be political intrigue, there's going to be paganism, there's going to be compromising doctrine in favor of expediency. And so the spirit of all this lives on today.
I'm going to have to ask you back on at some point later for a church history stream, because I agree with about 90 to 95% of what you said, with a few nuances here and there. I myself would hold to the Nicene Creed even as a Protestant, but the Nicene Creed itself was never meant to be this all-encompassing creed. It was meant to specifically address one particular controversy at the time, which was the Arian controversy. And this is where I have a problem with Catholicism and Orthodoxy, is that you have two very, very particular streams of early Christianity that have been dogmatized. And this is one of the advantages of Protestantism, is where it can take all of church history as a whole, see it as a whole, see the good things and the bad things that came with different movements down throughout the history of the church. But ultimately, the understanding of the Bible, and this is a particularly Protestant idea, the idea of sola scriptura, in which the scriptures alone are the word of God that are infallible for faith and practice. There is no concept of tradition or a magisterium that sits over scripture, or in the Orthodox case, the idea that scripture is merely one part of tradition. Certainly not the way the ancient Jews thought of the Tanakh, and certainly not the way that the early church thought of the scriptures. Augustine himself, when he is arguing against his Arian counterpart, says, "I will not quote Nicaea against you, and neither can you hold the authority of Ariminum against me, but let us look to the scriptures, which are the property of none," which I find the rather arrogant statement of many Orthodox or Catholics who say, "Well, we gave you the Bible," and it's like, even the early church fathers did not take that view of scripture that the later sacral churches take today. They clearly saw it as something of divine origin that was not under the authority of any church council. And Augustine is not arguing against his Arian counterpart on the basis of, well, my council is the true one holy Catholic Apostolic Church Council, and yours is the heretic council. There are, in fact, more bishops at the Arianized Council of Sirmium than there were at Nicaea. And Augustine is not arguing on the basis that Catholics or Orthodox would argue today. He is arguing in a very Protestant fashion, saying, no, the scriptures teach a Trinitarian conception of God, not an Arianized conception of God and Christ. And so that is what the Protestants were really doing in the Reformation, was this idea of theological retrieval. And is the early church a Protestant church? Of course not. But at the same time, neither was it Catholic nor Orthodox. And so it comes down to what is good and right and true theological development versus what is not. So I agree with, like I said, much of what you said. I think Constantine, in a lot of ways, I view him as the Donald Trump of the ancient world. He was a man who was trying to build a coalition to keep the Roman Empire together as a good civic nationalist, even though he himself was of Illyrian and not Italian origin. So that's my little spiel on church history there, but we can dive into that more at a later time. I wanted to sort of continue the conversation forward because I think you mentioned some really good things about why people would convert to Catholicism or Orthodoxy within the United States. And really, where do you see the origins of the Groyper movement? How do we explain the rise of somebody like a Nick Fuentes out of sort of the ash heap of the alt-right into this more religious version? Because the original alt-right, as you know, was populated by a Roosh V before he was converted to Christianity. It had men such as Jack Donovan, Rollo Tomasi, your pickup artists and your sort of neo-pagans and people like that into this more traditional Catholic / Orthodox, Groyper movement.
I think that you mentioned ashes, and that's based. The alt-right now really doesn't exist in any serious way. What happened is that there was a contingency of people there, I think, who wanted some kind of deep spirituality, but they were turned off by it wasn't as left-wing as it is now, but certainly it was even back then in 2016, 17, the leftward drift in American Christianity. They were turned off by that. They wanted deeper spirituality. And when the alt-right just crashed and burned, a lot of people, young men particularly, low status ones without much to look forward to in life, to be blunt, they were sort of left without a home. They weren't going to be terribly attractive to women, so finding a girlfriend, they couldn't necessarily just go out and do that. They also were not going to become, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, or arguably not even paper boys there today, given the politics company, so they could look forward to that. They could not necessarily look forward to seeing themselves be advanced through their own efforts, because a lot of these people were brought up in a culture, even though they dislike the left because it hates them, they were still brought up in a culture of what one might call learned helplessness. And perhaps a lot of them just aren't, I hate to be mean, but a lot of them just aren't terribly intelligent either. So that's always, in any situation, can be an issue. So I think you combine all this together much more. And what you get is a situation where you have a lot of people who are sort of lost their adrift, and they look to religion then, as people have done throughout the centuries. The thing of it is that, the religions were drifting ever leftward, and like I said, they couldn't really find a hope. So they wanted something that was countercultural, that would oppose the cultural paradigm that they lived in, that hated them, and obviously they hated in return. But they also want something that would give them spiritual sustenance, and that's where these trad movements come in. And it's no surprise that people who are some of the biggest supporters of them are online posting memes, sort of as the rejects of what would have been a coherent political movement, just to say the alt-right, before it was smashed into 1,000 pieces between Richard Spencer's Hailgate thing and then Charlottesville. So someone like Nick Fuentes, it's no surprise that he came to prominence in 2017, which is the same time that the alt-right was being destroying itself and being destroyed by others. And I think he just spoke to the angst a lot of people feel. He promised them a sort of spiritual path that they could follow. I don't think it's worked out well for them, because right now, Nick Fuentes, I think he's under, I don't know how many federal agencies have him under investigation. And obviously, just because you're under investigation doesn't mean you're guilty of anything. But his bank account was frozen. I think he said earlier in the year he's working with 4 lawyers simultaneously to deal with his problems. He was placed on a no-fly list. So a guy like Fuentes, and when it gets that far, it's pretty clear that he's not going to get much farther than that. I would not be surprised if he winds up being charged with something or other very serious soon enough. And I think after that, considering he's already been banned to the point that he's no longer on DLive, or I think even Trovo, if he ever was there at all. I think he's on his own streaming platform, his own website that people can sign up for. He's not going to be doing what he's doing for a very long time. That's the bottom line there. One way or another, I think in a year or two, he's going to be out of the picture when it comes to his show, and his followers then are going to be left without a home. And these people are not going to have much of anywhere to turn to, because even Roman Catholicism or Orthodoxy, the Orthodox priests are not going to, nor should they, go to bat for Groyperism. And in Roman Catholicism, Pope Francis, I think objectively would despise these people if he ever were made aware of them. And yet the Catholics among the Groypers are supposed to take his word as literal gospel. So they back themselves into a corner, a very sad situation. And I'm not terribly surprised by it, but I think this whole situation of theirs comes out of desperation. There are people who were left with nowhere to go, really nothing to attain other than perhaps a job that allowed them to rent an apartment and just live there until they were eligible for Social Security, where they probably then just rent another apartment. That's what they have to look forward to. Some might say, well, they could marry a girl who's of a similar mindset to them, but not too many women are very interested in this sort of thing to begin with, and more left-leaning. So and these guys I don't think are very high status to begin with, so I don't think they would have much prospect with the opposite sex from the onset. And then a lot of them, of course, are closeted gays, so they can't come to terms with that, so they turn to politics and the religion to compensate. So it's just really a long, drawn-out thing that it tells a very sad story, not only about these people, but the society which created them.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I wanted to ask a couple more questions about sort of the Trad-Cath side before turning to Orthodoxy before we wrap up. So how do you see these sort of Trad-Cath types? I think of guys like Michael Lofton at Reason and Theology. He's the one that I told you about, who tries to dress up and make this Catholic thing sound like, oh, we have reason and theology, and this sort of Thomas Aquinas and Aristotelian thing. And then you have characters such as Taylor Marshall, who is now going the way of a sedi vacantist, a former Episcopal priest who is now in the Catholic Church. You have guys like Matt Fradd, who is, this Australian guy, pints with Aquinas, or he's like, yeah, let's pull up and have a beer and talk about Aquinas, and then, let's get all the Protestants to convert to Catholicism, to the one true church, saying that with an Australian accent. How does this sort of like popular right-wing Catholic, movement reconcile the fact that their hierarchy has all gone to the left, that the left within Catholicism, especially within its academic institutions such as Notre Dame or Boston College, have all gone extremely liberal, and the fact that you have the second Catholic president in the United States, in United States history, who is clearly a lefty and is on very good terms with Francis. How do these sort of populist right-wing Catholics deal with this idea of cognitive dissonance? What is the Trad-Cath TLS for the United States?
I think that these people believe that they have a supernatural backing to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. They think that their branch of Catholicism will win out, even though there's no rational purpose to hold that position. And they're very adamant that some way, somehow, they will be able to see their vision be accepted by most of humanity, and that they will win out over part of the human race that doesn't agree with them, because they'll go to hell. And these people, I've heard more and more of them over the last few months or so, saying that we might not see this in our time. So I think they're beginning to understand that within their lives, they're not going to reap the rewards that they had been led to believe when they converted, or when they just became very involved with this trad stuff. And it's rather interesting. I would imagine that a lot of these people over the next 10 years will secularize. My theory is that a lot of these Trad-Caths, because they are so economically leftist, as they admittedly are, they love the big government to take care of them and everyone else. They just don't like social leftism. Apparently, they don't realize that the state gets more power, it's going to have more control over social issues, and the people who are going to be in the bureaucracy, generally speaking, are on the left. So they're certainly not going to be leading society in a more conservative direction. Even beyond that, when people just get used to receiving stuff from the government, they become less self-reliant, and that means that they're less interested in how do I put this personal responsibility, moreover, which obviously is a gateway to the left when you take away that angle. So I think that a lot of these people are just going to convert to the left, these Trad-Cath types. I think that they will probably give up their religion. I think they'll become SJWs. They'll be like, you can't beat them, join them. They'll probably see themselves as victims of the system. And because the system is not going to change to meet their specifications, they will just say, we'll join it and take what we can get. And I expect to see a lot of people who are Nick Fuentes fans join the left, probably more among the Catholic ranks than the Orthodox ones, because at least within Orthodoxy, there are different branches of it that remain traditional, and these ortho trad bros will have a home if they search hard enough for it. They might have to drive 45 minutes to an Orthodox mass, but they'll be able to find it. Not so in Roman Catholicism. Now, you do have these breakaway factions that are, like SSPX, and they're out there, but their congregations are not very numerous. I believe they're headquartered out in Kansas, and the people who go this route are going to be very isolated, and these are not people who thrive well in isolation. These Groypers, they want to be part of a group. So since there are more lefties near them, wherever they are, I think they'll just join up with the left, and they will look past the social leftism, or they might even embrace it, because they'll figure, well, what's the point? Being on the right didn't do anything for me. If the left is at least going to give me a home, then that's fine. And one thing that people overlook is that the American left loves converts. It's not like that you can't be on the right one day and on the left the next, and the left will reject you. The left loves to embrace people who used to be on the other side and saw the light. It's a way of, number one, sticking this matter in the face of people who are still on the right, or just the non-left, moreover. And number two, it's a way for the left to increase its ranks, which it's always looking to do, because it realizes that politics is entirely about demographics, which the right so often seems to ignore. And so, these Groypers would have no problem joining the left. I think they'd be very well received there.
That's good. So I want to play a little bit of rapid fire with you. I'm going to do a name game and a word association game, which I think you'll find rather amusing considering the names I'm about to bring up. Discussing Orthodoxy now. One of the reasons I think there has been a rise in Eastern Orthodoxy is the fact that a lot of people on the right who have become disgruntled with Protestantism, they may look into Catholicism for a time, but then they see the fact that the Pope himself is a leftist and that he has stacked the College of Cardinals with leftists, and they see the problems and the liberalism within Catholicism itself. And so your Matt Fradds and your Michael Loftons and your Taylor Marshall types, while there will always be a Franciscan University of Steubenville, which has the more right-wing sort of Catholicism, Steubenville is nowhere near as influential as a place like Boston College or Notre Dame. So those people will exist, but I think the reason that you're seeing this rise in Orthodoxy is, in fact, a very Protestant response. Yes, they've looked into Catholicism, but then they're like, no, the Catholic Church is wrong, so I'm going to go join the other traditional hierarchical church. In a lot of ways, it's very in keeping with the Protestant character of many of these converts to Eastern Orthodoxy. And they'll go join something exotic, specifically some of the jurisdictions I think you're referring to that cater to sort of the right wing would especially be the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, Rokor, that is the one that Rushdie is converted to. I think the Antiochian Church, which has a little bit more of an Arab history to it, and so a little bit more traditional right-wing Middle Eastern. Whereas people who are more, sort of Middle Americans, they may try out, the Orthodox Church in America because it's ostensibly the English version of Orthodoxy. But it's interesting because the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of the United States is still the biggest and most influential. And it's funny, Elpidophoros, their patriarch or metropolitan, I forget exactly what he is, archbishop, I think. He was marching at a Black Lives Matter rally last year, and he is close friends with Joe Biden and, very much supports Ukraine and the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which drives a lot of these ortho bros up the wall. And he also recently celebrated a liturgy in an Episcopalian church where 5 days before the rainbow flag had been given a blessing by the Episcopal priest. And so much for your one holy Catholic Apostolic Church. If the most visible hierarch in the United States of the Orthodox community is clearly a leftist himself. So let's play the name game real quick, Cotto. I think maybe about 10 to 15 more minutes, and then we'll wrap up. But I want to throw out some names. Rushdie, Rod Dreher, Lauren Witzke, Jay Dyer. Maybe you've heard of Jay Dyer.
Oh, sir.
Luke Kindrat, who is Ortho Nick Fuentes. So those are the names I wanted to throw out. Oh, and the curious case of one Matthew Heimbach. Here's a couple of phrases. Taking the side of Russia in the Ukraine conflict, because of course the ecumenical patriarch is a CIA asset. We were clearly, just trying to install a global homo, quote unquote, regime in Ukraine. From Russia, with Putin, with love, and then the desire for a czar. So go. As far as analyzing those phrases and those names,
I would say that. Geez, that's actually hard. Heimbach is the one. I would expect him to really say something out there first and foremost, presuming that he's even saying much of anything at all nowadays. I can't imagine he would be really all that interested in what's going on in the Ukraine because of his issues, which have led him to the left. I believe that he was back on the right. Was that the case, or is he still on the left? I don't know.
I have no idea.
I'm actually something of a dead end. I guess you'll have to help me out with this one.
So maybe I'll move away from that. Maybe what would motivate somebody like a Rod Dreher or a Lauren Witzke to convert to Orthodoxy? And maybe what would motivate somebody like a Rushdie?
I think that, you know, they have three different stories, but I think that looking at perhaps something all of them have in common, would it be? No, I don't know. Let me see. Dreher used to be Catholic and Protestant. Roosh, I believe, was an atheist or an agnostic. I'm not sure what Witzke used to be. I'm trying to see.
I think she grew up in a sort of low church evangelical, like Pentecostal type background or something.
Okay.
My understanding is obviously Roosh had the issues that he had with women. Lauren Witzke, I heard, had substance use. And then Rod Dreher seems like he was trying to find an intellectual home after sort of casting away his evangelical heritage as just a bunch of hayseed rubes and then seeing the problems within Catholicism. And so it seems to me that Orthodoxy in the United States, I'm not going to paint with too broad of a brush, but the sort of convert community, particularly among these young men and the people like Lauren Witzke, it seems to be people who have a lot of troubles in their personal lives, and it's like they're trying to find some sort of meaning in the smells and bells. And the evangelical megachurch, as we mentioned earlier, with the skinny jeans and the V-neck, seems to drive them away.
Yes, it does. There's no question. I mean, obviously they see substance in the traditions and the smells and the bells, and they believe that it will somehow, these traditions somehow will help them out with whatever problems they're going through. I'm just trying to figure out the solution to the word game, so to speak. I'm sort of stumped here, Dr. Bob.
Well, that's sort of not necessarily asking for a solution for the word game, but just sort of your take on the sort of zealous, like, convert, like, Roosh has found the Orthodox Church, or Witzke has found the Orthodox Church, and now we need to make America an Orthodox country with a star, and somehow that's going to solve all of our problems.
Yeah, my take on that is that these people are not, they might believe what they're saying, but I don't think they're very intellectually serious, because there's no way that what they're talking about is going to happen. I think that these people really want something to belong to because, as you said, they have a lot of personal problems and they can't seem to make a go of life on their own or as members of the community in which they were raised, regardless of whatever that community might be. So I think that really a lot of people are attracted to this Orthodox thing for the same reason they're attracted to Roman Catholicism, because they see something that's very high church, something that's exotic, something that's foreign, something that's different from what they're used to. And they hope that this difference, when incorporated into their own life, will make a positive difference in that life. I think they're very desperate to become something other than what they are or were. And, if people want change, that's fine.
Sure.
But them expecting, a religion to do all this for them is, I think, a very erroneous expectation indeed. And I think what tends to happen is that they continue to make, I can't speak to these individually, but people generally who go down this road, they tend to make poor choices even after they have their conversion because their personality doesn't change and their...
Oh, are you there?
That these people... Yo, I'm here.
Oh, excellent. I got out for just a second.
Oh my, sorry about that. But no, I think these people, they're looking for change, but what they really need to change is their own perspective on life, and they can't expect a religion to do the heavy lifting for them.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I won't give away the game too much, but I've had conversations with one of these individuals, and I do think it is a genuine conversion and that there has been a life change of sorts, but I think there is one thing that they're going to discover, and this is something that has kept me out of these movements, is that the sacramental treadmill is a ponderous chain to try and bear long term. And I think that is ultimately a fundamental contradistinction to the American character and to the tradition and to the culture that many of these people grew up with. This is not, 1300s Byzantium. This is not 16th century Spain. these people, like driving a car, going to a fast food restaurant, many of the freedoms and rights that they enjoy are specifically due to the legacy of a Protestant America, for better or for worse. It's interesting. One of these characters, Luke Kendrat of Orthodoxy First, and I don't want to beat up on the kid too much, but at the same time, it's like, learn your place, kid. Don't speak with such self-assurance. I saw on like his social media where he posted a picture of Tsar Nicholas II and his wife, the Tsarina. And it's like they were so perfect. Like, why did the Soviet Union have to come about? It's like, this desire to see a czar marching out, leading armies of holy orthodoxy to, convert the world. It's almost this very, crusader type attitude, but at the same time, almost the same kind of attitude in a way of the tent revivalist from the early 1800s.
Very, very similar. Obviously, there are cultural differences, but there are great similarities all the same. And I think that it just speaks to a lack. The fact that these people have to go to these, foreign religions speaks to a lack of interest in or appreciation for what one might refer to as traditional Americana. And, to a certain extent, it's understandable because that has been demonized tremendously over the last, since the 1960s, really. It's more than half a decade now. Basically, the image of Norman Rockwell's America has been treated as something idolatrous. And it's because the, traditional Anglo-Protestant religious perspective comes out of this Rockwellian America, it's looked at with terrible disdain. And so these people, I think, even if they view the culture which views, this traditional America with terrible disdain, I think that at the same time they are affected by it to a certain extent, in that they just don't like the normal, they don't like the mundane. They view it as having failed them, even if they don't like the leftist, superstructure which has replaced it. And so they look to this foreign, exotic stuff as some means of solving their problems, whatever they might be. Obviously, I can't talk about individuals specifically. This is all general, but I think that I think this is the general trend.
Yes, I think that's good. So maybe to wrap up here, Joseph, one question I have from more of a political perspective, since that is an area of expertise for you, is with the increasing number of American Orthodox, even though it's still only like 1 out of every 300 Americans. Do you think that this is something that is being encouraged by Russia? Do you think that the Russians see this as advantageous, that they have a more friendly population and possibly a wedge into wider American culture? In fact, one thing I think is interesting is that the head of the OCA, or the founder of the OCA, Orthodox Church in America, if I believe, was actually a KGB agent. Mm-hmm. And that do you see that? Do you think Russia is taking notice of this movement, and that they're going to try to use this to their advantage? And then the final question is, what do you see as the future of American Christianity, both its loss of cultural influence, the future of the quote-unquote religious right, the impact on the Republican Party, and then finally the sustainability of this sort of Groyper movement long-term? So maybe the Russia question first, and then the last to finish up on the future of American Christendom.
Sure. I think that the Russians, no doubt, are very, very much responsible, not totally, but certainly part, for the spread of orthodoxy in the U.S. They view it as a means of making Americans more open to Russian ideas, which is not bad in and of itself, and Russian culture. But I think that they're doing not because they want to have a cultural or religious exchange or evangelization. They're doing it because they want to establish Russian political influence within the U.S. and other countries too. It's not just the U.S. thing. So I'm sure the Russians are behind this to no small extent. I'm sorry, you had other great questions too. Would you mind repeating them?
Yeah, and just to your point on Russia, it's interesting that it's the jurisdictions of Rokor specifically, as well as the Antiochian parish, which is based out of Damascus, Syria, which has tremendous ties to Russia, the Assad regime, that these are the two jurisdictions within Eastern Orthodoxy in the United States that really, really seem to be growing are the ROCOR and the Antiochian jurisdictions. Not so much the Greek Orthodox archdiocese, because it seems to have this Greek cultural grounding, whereas it seems that the Russian and the Syrian church seem to be quite keen on attracting converts. So the last question I have is, where do you see the future of American Christianity? And there's sort of 4 points here. The future of the religious right, the impact that the change in American Christianity is going to have on the Republican Party, what the loss of cultural influence and cultural dominance means for Christians in the United States. And the last one is probably the least important, but maybe the most humorous, the long-term sustainability of the Groyper movement.
I'll do the last one first. The Groyper movement, I don't think has any long-term future. I think that even now, it's basically a shell of what it was in, say, 2019. I think it's just going to fade away until it basically, it's something that's not even mentioned much in the pages of history. Perhaps it's only like a footnote. I think that looking at the long-term picture of American Christianity, I think that it will be something that's very much a minority view, whether it's on the conservative or progressive end of the spectrum. I think that all major American Christian denominations, they're not going anywhere. They'll be much smaller, but they're not just going to shrivel up and die. I think that they're going to. I think they're going to be very much on the left, openly, and the people who are conservative will have to have like small independent fellowships. That's the way I see that going. And as far as the religious right goes, I don't think it has a big future. I think it'll be part of the GOP coalition, but I think that within 20 years, it'll be something. I think that people think of Christianity as generally a leftist influence in the U.S. because of these major denominations going the way they're going within 20 years. And many of the kids of those who are on the religious right will be hardcore lefties, as we already see. It's not something that happens in totality, but it is something that happens with greater and greater regularity. And this is whether or not those kids remain religious at all. So it's really, really a fascinating state of affairs. We're in a state of flux, to say the least.
Yeah. Just one last footnote that I think, is interesting that you mentioned about a lot of the established religions going left. I really do see, ironically enough, the Groyper movement, which seeks to find tradition in a high church or sacral model. That is typically where leftism has entered into Christendom generally, is through high church structures. If you look at where conservatism within Christianity is going to be centered in the future, I think you're very much right that it's going to be these low church, independent Baptist, Pentecostal type churches, home churches, these Bible study fellowships that ultimately are going to be bastions of conservative Christianity, and I think are going to be the most faithful in the long term. And I bring out this case in point, specifically what's going on in Canada right now. There are a couple of pastors who have been arrested for trying to gather their full congregations for worship. And now, whatever one may have thought about coronavirus at its height, if you look at the numbers today, I'm not going to say something too controversial. By the day, it gets safer and safer to do this. And so what's interesting is that in certain places, the lockdown measures seem to be getting harder and harder. And so there is a man by the name of James Coates who was arrested in Alberta, specifically in the Edmonton area. And he spent, I believe it was something like 34 or 35 days in prison for the crime of gathering his full congregation for meeting. They're literally meeting in an undisclosed location right now, very similar to churches in China. And there was another pastor who was arrested in Alberta as well this past week, another Baptist pastor by the name of Tim Stevens. Literally, he had gathered his congregation in woods to meet on Sunday morning, and there was a police helicopter that was incidentally flying by, spotted them, flew over them, took pictures of the assembly, and then 2 days later, police were showing up at Pastor Stephen's house, arresting him in front of his wife and his 8 children. And what is most interesting about this story is the fact that the Gospel Coalition Canada, which is sort of the big EVA, big establishment evangelicalism website in Canada, has actually defended the actions of the Canadian government, the province of Alberta, in not defending these pastors and telling them that, oh, it's okay to meet, it's okay to worship. They're not actually, there's no persecution here. Whereas, all of these churches have basically become state churches. They have bought into the guidelines of the Canadian government. They're all doing we're only going to have 10% capacity, and everybody else can Zoom church from home. And these are all men who are part of established churches. Whereas it's those who are in low churches, those who are in non-sacral churches, seem to be the ones that are resisting. You look at the Catholic hierarchy here in the United States, you look at the Orthodox hierarchy, they all blindly and rigidly follow government restrictions on capacity sizes, on mask wearing, on all the sanitation measures, which whether we believe they're effective or not, that's they all rigidly fell in line with the government. And I think it's intrinsic to the history of specifically Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and even a lot of mainline established Protestant churches, that they are in fact state churches at the end of the day, and state churches tend to be the ones that go left, where it's the independent small churches that seem to be the ones, if these young people are actually looking for tradition, are the places they're more likely to find a traditional conservative congregation that holds to traditional Christian morals, values, and beliefs.
Mm-hmm. I agree entirely. The more a church becomes entangled with the state, obviously the more it has to reflect the state's public policy, or else the state will clamp down on it. And no religion, I think, wants to fall the fate of that pastor who was arrested, as you mentioned, in Alberta. The situation, how it pans out, is unsurprising, even though it certainly is not good for the separation between church and state, or religious liberty war, or arguably the concept of liberty itself on a grand scale.
Yes, and this is to give away the game as we close out tonight, Joseph. But one of the areas, I think you, as somebody who is I believe you describe yourself as a secular Jewish humanist, and me as somebody who is a Reformed Calvinistic Baptist, is that we both realize that separation of church and state is ultimately a good thing, not because it protects the state from the church, but because it protects the church from the state. It is a two-way street.
Absolutely, it is, and that's integral if you want to have a society where individuals are allowed to live as they choose, as long as they don't intrude on others' rights and liberties. When you have a situation where you have a state religion, you're going to have the religion parroting the state. And a lot of people don't seem to understand that the nature of bureaucracies is to trend leftward over time, because it's about collectivism, it's about group identity, and it ultimately is about keeping this stuff together through any means possible, which means, people are not going to have the sort of principles necessary to maintain something of a non-leftist nature. So many leftist political developments simply come out of people wanting power, them wanting to get a coalition to have power, and they therefore seek to deal with different groups in this coalition on a collective level without much regard for the individual. And so there you have collectivist phenomena that are really, I can't even begin to get into them here, but it pertains to everything from economics to rules that govern how people worship, or if they choose to worship, that is. So it's a very long-winded matter, but a profoundly important one all the same.
And that is, you see it in the theology itself, where you will hear from people who join Catholicism and Orthodoxy that they have been converted to the church, whereas you'll hear in low churches, people are converted to Christ. And
Absolutely correct.
It's a very individual salvation. Recognizing that, yes, there is a larger group, but at the end of the day, you are ultimately accountable before God for your own salvation, not because you joined a particular religious organization.
Mm-hmm. It's really important that people, I think, be their own person one way or the other. And if you are going to look to a church or something else, an organization, whatever, to save you, rather than trying to save yourself in one way or another, it's going to be problematic. And I think that the low church approach to salvation, though I'm not a Christian, it's more sensible than the high church one, because it's about people seeking to save themselves through Jesus. Meanwhile, with the higher churches, they're seeking to save themselves through the church, which is sort of like a mediation point between them and Jesus. So it certainly is not a good thing to put these churches, which are essentially human beings, between you and your definition of spirituality, because you'll wind up being controlled by these people.
Yeah. And I say this last word as a Calvinist in this regard, that ultimately, as a low church Calvinist, it is God and God alone who saves. And it is not a church, it's not a sacrament, it is not a particular religious ritual, but it is through belief and confession in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that is something that I think is sorely missing from the Groyper movement.
You mean confession isn't to a gay priest? That's quite revolutionary. Who would think that such a thing could actually happen? Yes. Yeah, the confession thing, I must say, in Catholicism is something particularly damaging, because not only is it contrary to the exact words of the Bible, but you give someone your secrets and such, and you sort of exalt this person morally. Meanwhile, the average Roman Catholic priest doesn't even believe in all the doctrines. He's living a lie in terms of sexual orientation. And I mean, this is not the kind of person you want to have dominance over your spiritual affairs, to say the absolute least.
Yes. Let me read a couple of last quotes to you, Joseph. I think this will be quite enlightening to you. So one is against Catholicism and one against Orthodoxy, from a Protestant church historian who lived about a century and a quarter ago, by the name of Philip Schaff, who is really the father of modern church history. He wrote this about, there's a great book you should read at some point called The Pope and the Professor. It's about the life of Dr. John Joseph Ignatius Dollinger, who is Catholicism's foremost scholar at the time of Vatican I in the late 1800s. And he actually ended up leaving the organized Catholic Church over Vatican I. And here is Schaff's commentary on that episode. He says, during the Vatican Council, this is from Schaff, History of the Christian Church, Volume 1, page 39. In 1870, so during the Vatican Council in 1870, Dollinger broke with Rome because the theological leader of the Old Catholic Recession, he became the theological leader of the Old Catholic Recession and was excommunicated by the Archbishop of Munich, his former pupil, April 17th, 1871, as being guilty of the crime of open and formal heresy. And here is a funny little aside that Schaff puts in. He knows too much of church history to believe in the infallibility of the Pope. He solemnly declared that as a Christian and as a theologian and as a historian and as a citizen, he could not accept the Vatican decrees because they contradict the spirit of the gospel and the genuine tradition of the church, and if carried out must involve church and state, the clergy and the laity, in irreconcilable conflict. And here is Schaff's commentary on the Eastern Church. This is from Volume 4, page 134. Viewed in its relation to the Eastern Church, which it robbed of its fairest dominions, Mohammedanism was a well-deserved divine punishment for the unfruitful speculations, bitter contentions, empty ceremonialism, and virtual idolatry which degraded and disgraced the Christianity of the East after the 5th century. The essence of true religion, which is love to God and to man, was eaten out by rancor and strife, and there was left no power of ultimate resistance to the foreign conqueror. The hatred between the Orthodox Eastern Church and the Eastern schismatics, driven from her communion, and the jealousy between the Greek and Latin churches prevented them from aiding each other in efforts to arrest the progress of the common foe. The Greeks detested the Latin filioque as a heresy more deadly than Islam, while the Latins cared more for the supremacy of the Pope than the triumph of Christianity, and set up during the Crusades a rival hierarchy in the East. Even now, Greek and Latin monks in Bethlehem and Jerusalem are apt to fight at Christmas and Easter over the cradle and grave of their common Lord and Redeemer, unless Turkish soldiers keep them in order. And that is Schaff writing on the state of Christianity in Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy in the late 1800s. And I dare say that if you listen to the online Groyper discussions between Orthodox and Catholics, there is no less rancor today than there was 130 to 140 years ago.
I agree entirely, and it's very sad to see because these people are fighting over something needless. But then again, in Judaism, there's a long history of people fighting over small distinctions as well. So I could certainly relate. But it's all this stuff is just very sad to see. But when it comes to the Groypers, it's rather bizarre that there is this sort of Catholic Orthodox coalition. When in reality, if the Groypers somehow, this is never going to happen, but if they ever did come to power, these Catholics and these they all hate the Protestants. These Catholics and these Orthodox would then be at each other's throats immediately over, basically the same thing.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, that is why, once again, I advocate for a free church and a free state where the gospel of Christ can be preached freely, without hindrance, and that it is those who believe are those who make up the church. And we leave ultimate judgment to God, not to ecclesiastical authorities.
It is very important not to adopt a spirit of clericalism, because at the end of the day, the prelates are people and they will always let the public down.
Yes. All right. And with that, I think our broadcast is done for tonight. Thank you, Joseph. I'd love to have further conversations.
Same here. I'd very much like to have you back on Cotto Gottfried as well.
Oh, yes. I would love to. If you have any religious or even medical themed discussions in the future, obviously trying to get around YouTube censorship, maybe a Rumble episode on health-related topics.
Well, if you wouldn't mind, actually, I think this discussion would be great if I could upload it to the Cotto Gottfried Rumble and podcasting outlets. I think that'd be great. I would specify that's not an episode of Cotto Gottfried, but it was a discussion I had with Dr. Bob, and I think it fits in very well with Cotto Gottfried episodes.
I think we can certainly do that, and I'll talk to you offline, and we'll get the file to you to upload to the channel.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Bob. That'd be outstanding. And I thank you for having me on, and I thank everyone who watched tonight.
All right. Thank you so much, Joseph. All right, everybody. Take care. Have a good night. God bless. Bye.